The cobblestones of Rue Saint-Antoine gleamed wet in the pre-dawn darkness as Marie Dubois unlocked her bakery, just like she had every morning for 3 years. To the German patrol walking past, she was simply another French baker starting her day. They had no idea that beneath her flour-dusted apron lay forged papers that would spirit 20 Jewish children out of Paris by nightfall. Marie had once been Professor Marie Leclerc, a linguistics expert who spoke 6 languages fluently. Now she was the ghost of Montmartre, the resistance operative the Nazis couldn't catch. Her bakery served as the perfect front. Who would suspect a quiet woman kneading bread of coordinating escape routes that stretched from Paris to the Swiss border? But today felt different. The new SS officer had been asking too many questions about the Jewish families who'd vanished from the neighborhood. Marie's contact was 3 hours late, and the children were hidden in her cellar, growing restless and scared. As she lit the ovens, Marie noticed fresh boot prints in her alley, prints that weren't there yesterday. Had her luck finally run out? The heavy oak door groaned shut behind her, its familiar creak now sounding ominous in the morning silence. Marie's fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the light switch, muscle memory guiding her through the motions that had become second nature. The warm yellow glow revealed her sanctuary, rows of empty shelves waiting to be filled with the day's bread, the massive stone ovens that had fed this neighborhood for generations, and the wooden counter worn smooth by countless transactions. Everything appeared normal, too normal. Marie forced herself to breathe steadily as she moved toward the back room, her soft-soled shoes silent against the worn wooden floors. The scent of yesterday's baking still lingered in the air, mingling with the dampness that seeped up from the cellar below. Down there, 20 pairs of young eyes were counting on her, 20 lives hanging in the balance. She pressed her ear to the cellar door and heard nothing. Good. The children were following instructions, remaining silent until the all-clear signal, but their presence weighed on her like stones in her chest. Each passing hour increased the danger exponentially. Marie began her routine, measuring flour with practiced precision while her mind raced through contingency plans. The missing contact could mean anything: capture, betrayal, or simply bad weather delaying the transport truck. In her 3 years of resistance work, she had learned that hope and paranoia were equally dangerous luxuries. The first batch of dough came together under her expert hands, the familiar rhythm of kneading usually a source of comfort. Today, it felt like marking time until disaster struck. Through the front window, she could see the street beginning to stir. Madame Rousseau from the flower shop swept her front steps, and young Henri wheeled his bicycle past, newspaper bag slung over his shoulder. Normal life continuing its dance while 20 Jewish children hid beneath the cobblestones. A sharp knock at the front door shattered the morning calm. Marie's hands stilled in the dough, her heart hammering against her ribs. Too early for customers, too sharp for friends. Through the glass, she could make out a tall figure in the grey uniform that had become the colour of nightmares. SS Obersturmführer Klaus Weber, the new officer who had been systematically dismantling resistance cells across the district. His pale eyes and methodical approach had already claimed dozens of lives. Marie wiped her hands on her apron, her fingers brushing against the forged papers hidden in the inner pocket. She had memorized every detail of those documents. Birth certificates, travel permits, ration cards, all bearing the signatures and stamps that would transform 20 terrified children into legitimate evacuees from a bombing zone. If Weber found them, those papers would be her death warrant. She unlocked the door with steady hands, calling upon years of performance to mask her terror behind the weary smile of a working woman. "Bonjour, Herr Obersturmführer," she said in carefully accented French, playing the role of the simple baker who struggled with German names. "You are early this morning. The bread will not be ready for another hour." Weber stepped inside without invitation, his boots clicking against the floor with military precision. His pale eyes swept the bakery with the thoroughness of a man who saw threats in shadows. "Madame Dubois," he said, his French flawless but cold. "I hope you do not mind the early visit. I find that dawn often reveals truths that daylight obscures. Marie kept kneading, forcing her movements to remain natural, even as every instinct screamed at her to run. Truth, Herr Obersturmführer. I am not sure what truths a simple bakery might hold, except perhaps the secret to a perfect croissant. Weber's smile held no warmth. Ah, but secrets are exactly what interest me, madame. Particularly secrets about missing neighbors. In the cellar below, 20 children waited in darkness, their lives depending on Marie's next words. The first loaves emerged from the oven at precisely 6:30, their golden crusts crackling in the morning air. Marie pulled them out with practiced efficiency, her movements automatic after 3 years of this routine. The bakery filled with the rich aroma of fresh bread, a scent that had become both her shield and her prison. She arranged the baguettes in neat rows, their warm surfaces steaming slightly in the cool morning air. Through the front window, she could see the town of Beaumont beginning to stir. A milk cart rattled down the cobblestones, its driver nodding to her through the glass. Everything appeared normal, peaceful even, if one ignored the German patrol that marched past every morning at 7:15. The bell above her door chimed, and Henri Dubois shuffled in, his weathered face creased with exhaustion. The old man had aged years in the past months, ever since his grandson disappeared into the resistance networks that everyone whispered about but no one acknowledged. "Please." His eyes darted nervously toward the window. "Have you heard anything about the Kohler family? Their shop has been closed for 3 days now." Marie's hands never paused as she wrapped his daily baguette. "I'm sure they've simply gone to visit relatives. These are uncertain times. People travel when they can." Henri nodded, though his expression remained troubled. He placed his coins on the counter and accepted the wrapped bread. As he turned to leave, he paused. "My late wife always said you had the kindest eyes in Beaumont, Marie. She said eyes like yours could see straight into a person's soul." He met her gaze meaningfully. "Sometimes I think she was right." After he left, Marie stood motionless for several heartbeats. Henri's words carried weight beyond their surface meaning, and she wondered how many others suspected the truth about her nocturnal activities. The thought should have terrified her, but instead it brought an odd sense of relief. Living a double life was exhausting, and the prospect of being truly seen, even partially, felt like a small mercy. The morning rush began in earnest. Madame Petit arrived for her morning croissants, followed by young Claude Martin, who worked at the railway station and always bought 2 pains au chocolat before his shift. Marie served each customer with the same cheerful efficiency, her mind automatically cataloguing their faces, their routines, their potential loyalties. In occupied France, survival depended on such calculations. At 8:30, just as she was refilling the display case, 2 figures in dark coats approached her shop. Marie's pulse quickened, but her hands remained steady as she arranged the pastries. Through the window, she watched Hauptsturmführer Klaus Weber and his translator, a thin French collaborator named Rousseau, pause outside her door. Weber was relatively new to Beaumont, having arrived only 6 weeks ago to replace his predecessor. Unlike the previous commander, who had been content to maintain order through routine patrols, Weber seemed genuinely interested in the town's residents. He had visited several shops already, always polite, always observant, always asking questions that seemed innocent, but felt carefully calculated. "The Hauptsturmführer wishes to compliment you on the excellent quality of your bread," Rousseau said. "He says it reminds him of his grandmother's baking in Bavaria." "How kind of him," Marie replied, offering her practiced smile. "Please tell the Hauptsturmführer that I'm honored by the comparison." Weber nodded and spoke again, his eyes never leaving Marie's face. This time, his words carried a different weight. "He wishes to know if you've noticed anything unusual lately," Rousseau translated. "There have been reports of suspicious activities in the area, people disappearing without explanation. He's concerned for the safety of all residents." Marie's mind raced, but her expression remained placid. "Suspicious activities? I'm afraid I don't understand. I spend most of my time here in the bakery or at home. My life is quite routine." Weber's eyes narrowed slightly as he listened to the translation. He stepped closer to the counter, close enough that Marie could smell his cologne and see the small scar above his left eyebrow. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost conversational. He says that sometimes the most observant people are those who seem to live the quietest lives, Rousseau translated. Bakers, for instance, work early hours. They might see things that others miss, people coming and going at unusual times. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken implications. Marie felt as though she were balanced on a knife's edge, one wrong word away from disaster. "I'm afraid my attention is usually focused on my ovens during those early hours," she said finally. "Hot bread demands constant vigilance." The morning bell above the bakery door chimed with deceptive innocence as Hauptmann Klaus Weber stepped inside, his polished boots clicking against the worn wooden floor. Marie's hands never paused in their work, continuing to knead the dough as if the arrival of the Gestapo officer was nothing more than another customer seeking their daily bread. "Guten Morgen, Fräulein Dubois," Weber said, his French heavily accented but precise. He removed his cap, revealing thinning blonde hair that he kept meticulously combed. "Such dedication to your craft. Always here before dawn, I'm told." Marie looked up with the practiced smile she'd perfected over months of occupation, neither too friendly nor too cold. "Bread waits for no one, Hauptmann. The people of Beaumont must eat, regardless of what else troubles our world." Weber nodded approvingly, but his pale eyes remained calculating as they swept the bakery. Behind the counter, old Henri continued sorting yesterday's unsold loaves with studied concentration, though Marie could see the slight tremor in his weathered hands. Indeed, simple pleasures in difficult times. Weber approached the counter, his gaze lingering on the flour-dusted surfaces, the neat rows of cooling racks, the ordinary tools of an ordinary trade. "Tell me, have you noticed anything unusual lately? Strangers passing through town, perhaps? People who don't quite belong?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Marie's heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands maintained their steady rhythm. She'd rehearsed this moment countless times in her mind, knowing it would come eventually. "Unusual?" She paused to brush a strand of hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist, leaving a small streak of flour. "What do you mean? We see travelers sometimes, but most people these days prefer to stay close to home." Weber reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small leather notebook, its pages filled with neat German script. 3 families from the Jewish quarter in Lyon have disappeared over the past month. The Rosenbergs, the Cohens, and the Friedmans vanished without a trace, as if they simply dissolved into the morning mist. Marie shaped the dough into portions with mechanical precision, each movement betraying nothing of the recognition that flashed through her mind. The Rosenbergs, she remembered their terrified faces, the way little Sarah had clutched her doll as Marie led them through the forest paths to the safe house. The Cohens had been older, grateful beyond words, when she'd provided them with forged papers and directions to the Spanish border. "How terrible," she murmured, shaking her head with what she hoped appeared to be genuine sympathy. Though perhaps they simply relocated. Times like these, people move to be with family or to find work. Perhaps. Weber's tone suggested he found this explanation inadequate. But these disappearances follow a pattern. Each family was last seen in villages along what we might call a corridor, a route that leads from Lyon toward the Pyrenees. Beaumont sits directly along this theoretical path. The Hauptmann moved closer to the counter, close enough that Marie could smell the pomade in his hair and see the small scar that bisected his left eyebrow. "You understand, of course, that anyone assisting in such disappearances would be considered an enemy of the Reich. The consequences would be severe." Henri finally spoke, his voice gravelly from decades of flour dust and early mornings. "We're simple bakers, Herr Hauptmann. We know nothing of such matters. Our world begins and ends with wheat and yeast." Weber's smile was thin as winter ice. "Of course, simple bakers." He flipped through several pages of his notebook, then looked up sharply. "Yet someone in this region is providing assistance to these fugitives. Someone with local knowledge, someone trusted by the community, someone who appears above suspicion. Marie placed the shaped loaves onto a wooden peel, preparing to slide them into the oven. The familiar ritual helped steady her nerves, grounding her in the role she'd played for so long it had become a second skin. "I wish we could be of more help," she said, opening the oven door and sliding the bread inside with practiced ease. "But as Henri said, we're just bakers. Our customers come for bread, not conversation about politics or missing persons." Weber closed his notebook with a sharp snap and tucked it away. "I'm sure you understand that I'll be making regular visits to ensure the continued peace and security of Beaumont. Perhaps our conversations will jog your memory about any unusual activities you might have witnessed." He replaced his cap and moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the brass handle. "By the way, Fräulein Dubois, that's quite an impressive oven you have there. Large enough to hide all sorts of things, I imagine." The words struck like a physical blow, but Marie forced herself to laugh. A light, unconcerned sound that echoed strangely in the suddenly oppressive space. "Only bread, Hauptmann, only bread." Weber touched the brim of his cap in a mock salute and stepped back into the grey morning, leaving behind the lingering scent of danger and the terrible weight of scrutiny that would follow her every move. The smell of burnt flour lingered in Marie's nostrils as she scrubbed the morning's mixing bowls, her hands moving mechanically while her mind raced through the events at the Dubois farm. 3 days had passed since she'd delivered the family to what she prayed was safety, but the weight of uncertainty pressed against her chest like a stone. The bell above her shop door chimed, and Marie's shoulders tensed before she recognized the familiar shuffle of Madame Leclerc's worn shoes. The elderly woman approached the counter with her usual morning ritual, eyeing the day-old bread with the careful consideration of someone counting every franc. "The usual, madame?" Marie asked, forcing warmth into her voice despite the exhaustion that had settled deep in her bones. "If you please, dear." Madame Leclerc's weathered fingers drummed against the counter. "Such strange happenings lately. The Brennan house has been empty for days now, windows dark, garden untended." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Some say they left in the night." Marie's hands stilled as she reached for the bread. The Brennan family, she'd helped them escape 2 weeks ago, a Jewish family who'd been hiding in plain sight until a neighbor's suspicious glances had grown too frequent. "Perhaps they had family business elsewhere," she replied carefully, wrapping the loaf in yesterday's newspaper. "Perhaps." Madame Leclerc's pale eyes studied Marie's face. Though one wonders what sort of business requires leaving everything behind. Even their cat wanders the streets crying for them. The image of the abandoned cat stirred something painful in Marie's chest. She'd never considered the small casualties of their escapes. The pets left behind, the neighbors who worried, the holes torn in the fabric of their small community. Each rescue created ripples she couldn't control. After Madame Leclerc shuffled away, Marie found herself staring at the newspaper she'd used to wrap the bread. A small article tucked between reports of German victories mentioned increased security measures along the southern borders. Her blood chilled as she read about new checkpoints, additional patrols, stricter documentation requirements. The southern route, the very path she'd sent the Dubois family down, was being systematically sealed. The morning dragged with unusual slowness. Few customers ventured in, and those who did spoke in hushed tones about the increased German presence in town. Marie caught fragments of worried conversations, soldiers asking questions, families being questioned about their neighbors, rewards offered for information about suspicious activities. By noon, her nerves felt frayed as old rope. She was kneading dough for the afternoon's baking when the shop door opened with unusual force, causing the bell to clatter violently. Marie looked up to see a figure she didn't recognize, a thin man in a threadbare coat, his face pale and drawn with exhaustion. "We're closed for lunch," she said automatically, though something in his desperate expression made her step closer to the counter. "Please," he whispered, glancing nervously at the windows. "Pierre Dubois sent me. He said that you could help." Marie's heart hammered against her ribs. Pierre had given her name to someone else. The cardinal rule of their network was discretion. No names, no direct contact, no unnecessary risks. Yet here stood a stranger asking for help in broad daylight, in her shop where anyone might overhear. "I'm afraid you're mistaken," she said loudly enough to carry to the street, while simultaneously gesturing for him to move away from the windows. "I'm simply a baker." The man's face crumpled. "My daughter," he breathed. "She's only 8. They came for us last night, but we escaped through the cellar. Pierre says many things," Marie interrupted, her mind racing through possibilities. If this man had been at the farm recently enough to speak with Pierre, it meant the family had reached their destination safely. But it also meant their network was being talked about, names being shared too freely. She studied the stranger's face, noting the genuine terror in his eyes, the way his hands shook as he clutched his coat. A father protecting his child. She'd seen that desperation before, recognized its authenticity, but authenticity didn't guarantee safety. "Wait here," she said finally, moving to lock the front door and flipped the sign to closed. The man sagged with relief, and Marie felt the familiar weight of another life settling onto her shoulders. As she led him to the back room, Marie's thoughts turned to the newspaper article about border security, to Madame Leclerc's observations about missing neighbors, to the increasing boldness of both those seeking help and those hunting them. The delicate balance she'd maintained for months was shifting, becoming more precarious with each passing day. She would help this man and his daughter. She couldn't do otherwise. But as she began explaining the process, the safe houses, the signals and passwords, Marie couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out for all of them. The knock came at precisely 6:15 in the morning, just as Marie was pulling the first batch of bread from the ovens. The sound echoed through the bakery with an authority that made her blood freeze. 3 sharp raps, followed by 2 more. Not the casual tap of a regular customer or the hurried knock of someone seeking shelter from the rain. She wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron, forcing her breathing to steady. Through the frosted glass of the front door, she could make out 2 dark silhouettes against the grey dawn light. Her mind raced through the possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Had someone seen the Goldsteins leaving through the back entrance 3 nights ago? Had Henri been caught with forged papers? "Madame Dubois?" The voice carried the clipped accent she'd learned to fear. "We need to speak with you." Marie smoothed her hair and walked to the door, her steps measured and calm despite the hammering of her heart. She turned the key and opened it just wide enough to see 2 men in dark coats, one tall and thin with wire-rimmed glasses, the other shorter but broader, with hands that looked capable of breaking bones. "Gentlemen, the bakery doesn't open for another hour," she said, injecting just the right amount of irritation into her voice. "I'm still preparing." "We're not here for bread." The taller man pushed past her into the shop, his companion following close behind. "I am Obersturmführer Richter, and this is Sergeant Mueller. We have questions about your recent clientele." Marie's mouth went dry, but she maintained her composure. "My clientele? I serve whoever has ration cards and francs, the Germans, the French, anyone who's hungry." She gestured toward the shelves lined with yesterday's remaining loaves. "Bread doesn't discriminate." Richter's pale eyes swept the bakery, taking in every detail, the worn wooden counters, the glass display cases, the narrow stairs leading to her apartment above. "How long have you operated this establishment, madame? And your husband? Where is he now?" "Dead. Killed at Sedan in 1940. The grief in her voice wasn't entirely fabricated. Jean had indeed died in the war, though not in the way these men believed. Mueller spoke for the first time, his voice rough as gravel. "We've had reports of unusual activity in this neighborhood. People coming and going at odd hours, Jewish families who were here one day and gone the next." Marie felt sweat gathering between her shoulder blades, but she forced herself to shrug. "People move around these days. Some flee to the countryside. Others look for work in the cities. It's not unusual." "The Goldstein family," Richter said suddenly, watching her face carefully. "They lived 3 streets over. The neighbors say you sometimes sold them bread after hours. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Sarah Goldstein had been a regular customer, often coming just before closing to buy day-old bread at reduced prices. It would be natural for Marie to remember her. Yes, I remember them. They had 2 young children, sweet family. They disappeared 4 days ago, along with their belongings. I wouldn't know anything about that, Marie replied, meeting his gaze steadily. They haven't been in for bread recently, but as I said, people move around. Richter moved closer, and she could smell his cologne mixed with cigarette smoke. You see, Madame Dubois, we have reason to believe that certain sympathizers in this area have been helping undesirable elements relocate, providing them with papers, safe houses, transportation. Marie's mind flashed to the hidden compartment beneath her flower storage, where forged documents waited for the next family in need, to the map of safe houses sewn into the lining of her coat, to the radio transmitter concealed in her bedroom wall. That sounds very dangerous, she said, and very foolish. Anyone caught doing such things would surely face severe consequences. Indeed, they would. Muller's smile was cold as winter steel. Death, most likely, or worse. The word hung in the air like smoke from a crematorium. Marie forced herself to think of fresh bread, of customers laughing at her counter, of anything except the images Muller's words conjured. Well, gentlemen, I certainly hope you catch whoever is responsible for these activities. She moved toward the door, a clear invitation for them to leave. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a business to run. Richter didn't move. Instead, he picked up a small loaf from the display case, turning it over in his hands. We'll be watching this neighborhood very carefully, madame. Very carefully indeed. I'm sure that will make everyone feel much safer, Marie replied. The 2 men finally moved toward the door, but Richter paused on the threshold. One more thing. If you remember anything about the Goldsteins or their departure, you'll contact us immediately. Of course. After they left, Marie stood motionless for a full minute before her legs gave out. The morning fog clung to the cobblestones like ghostly fingers as Marie made her way through the empty streets toward the bakery. Her wooden shoes echoed against the ancient stones, a rhythm she'd grown accustomed to over the past 3 years of occupation. The familiar weight of her canvas bag pressed against her shoulder, containing the usual supplies, flour rations, a thermos of ersatz coffee, and today, something far more dangerous hidden beneath a false bottom. She paused at the corner of Rue Saint-Michel, listening. The silence was too complete even for this early hour. Usually she could hear the distant rumble of German patrols or the occasional bark of orders from the garrison. Today, nothing. The hair on the back of her neck prickled with the same instinct that had kept her alive through countless close calls. The bakery stood before her like an old friend, its weathered wooden sign creaking gently in the pre-dawn breeze. Marie withdrew her keys, noting automatically that the chalk mark she'd left on the doorframe remained undisturbed. No one had entered during the night. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, inhaling the lingering scent of yesterday's bread, a ghost of better times when wheat was plentiful and her ovens ran from dawn to dusk. Now, she lit only 2 ovens instead of 4, conserving the precious fuel that came through her other channels. As she moved through the familiar motions of preparing for the day, her mind wandered to the documents currently pressed against her ribs, sewn into the lining of her worn coat. Identity papers for the Goldstein family. Father, mother, 2 children under 10. They would become the Gardens. Catholic refugees from Alsace seeking shelter with distant relatives. The bell above her door chimed, startling her from her thoughts. Far too early for customers. Marie's hand instinctively moved toward the rolling pin on her counter as she called out, "We're not open yet." "Good morning, Madame Dubois." The voice carried a slight accent that made her blood run cold. She turned to find Klaus Richter, the young Gestapo officer who'd been making increasingly frequent visits to her shop. His pale blue eyes swept the bakery with practiced efficiency. Herr Richter. She forced her voice to remain steady, even as her pulse quickened. "You're up early this morning." As are you. He stepped closer, his polished boots clicking against her worn wooden floors. Tell me, do you always arrive before sunrise? The bread doesn't bake itself. Marie turned back to her work, kneading dough with perhaps more force than necessary. Though I'm afraid I have little to offer today. The flour ration has been adequate for your needs, I'm sure. His tone carried an edge she hadn't heard before. You seem to manage quite well, considering the circumstances. The weight of the forged papers against her ribs felt suddenly enormous. Marie concentrated on keeping her breathing steady, her movements natural. One learns to make do. Would you care for some coffee? It's not real coffee, of course, but where were you last Tuesday evening? The question hit her like a physical blow. Tuesday, the night she'd helped the Rosenberg family reach the safe house near the river. The night old Henri Moreau had been seen talking to shadows near the cathedral. The night everything had started to unravel. Tuesday? She frowned, as if trying to remember. I believe I was here, cleaning the ovens. It takes several hours, and I prefer to do it when the shop is closed. Alone. Of course alone. Who would help an old baker clean ovens? She managed a tired laugh. Unless you're volunteering, Herr Richter. His smile was thin as a razor's edge. You have a sense of humor, madame. I appreciate that in these dark times. He moved to examine the bread she'd laid out for the day, picking up a small loaf and turning it over in his hands. This is well made. You have considerable skill. My father was a baker, his father before him. The truth served her well now. It's honest work. Indeed. He set the bread down carefully. And honest people should have nothing to fear from honest questions. His eyes met hers directly. Several families have disappeared from the Jewish quarter in recent weeks, families who should have reported for relocation. Marie's heart hammered against her ribs, but she met his gaze without flinching. I wouldn't know anything about that. I serve whoever comes to my shop, but I don't ask questions about where my customers go when they leave. How wise of you. Richter adjusted his gloves with deliberate precision. Questions can be dangerous things. They lead to answers, and answers? He shrugged. Well, they change everything, don't they? The morning light was growing stronger now, casting long shadows across the bakery floor. Soon, her regular customers would begin arriving, and this dangerous dance would have to end. But something in Richter's manner told her this was far from over. He moved toward the door, then paused. I'll be seeing you again soon, Madame Dubois. Very soon. The acrid smell of burned flour hung in the air as Marie swept the remnants of her ruined loaves into a bucket. Her hands trembled, not from exhaustion, but from the memory of Klaus Weber's cold eyes studying every corner of her bakery just hours before. She had managed to maintain her composure during his inspection, but now, alone in the pre-dawn darkness, the full weight of her precarious situation crashed down upon her. A soft knock at the back door made her freeze. 3 quick taps, followed by 2 slower ones, the signal she'd been dreading. Marie glanced at the clock. 4:30 in the morning. Too early for her usual routine, too dangerous for any legitimate business. She wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron and approached the door with careful steps. "Who is it?" she whispered. "Father Michel sent me," came the hushed reply. "There are problems at the church." Marie's blood ran cold. The church served as one of their primary safe houses, and Father Michel never sent messengers unless something had gone catastrophically wrong. She unlatched the door to find a young woman no older than 20, her dark hair matted with sweat and dirt, her clothes torn. Marie's legs nearly gave way. The Rosenbergs had been under her care for 3 days, waiting for forged papers that would allow them to cross into Switzerland. She had personally vouched for their safety, promised their elderly grandmother that her son and his children would survive this nightmare. All of them? Marie managed to ask. The messenger shook her head. The youngest boy, Samuel, he got away. Father Michel hid him in the crypt, but they'll search there next. We need to move him now. Marie's mind raced through possibilities, each more dangerous than the last. The Gestapo would be watching all known safe houses. The train station would be crawling with soldiers. Every route they'd used successfully in the past would now be compromised. How did they know? Marie asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Someone talked, the young woman confirmed. The Germans knew about the hidden room, knew how many people were inside, even knew their names. A wave of nausea swept over Marie. In her 18 months of resistance work, they'd never had a security breach this severe. Either they had a traitor in their network, or the Gestapo had become far more sophisticated in their methods than anyone had anticipated. "Where is the boy now?" Marie asked, already reaching for her coat. "Still at the church, but Father Michel says we have maybe an hour before they return with dogs." But the alternative, allowing an innocent boy to fall into Gestapo hands, was unthinkable. "Tell Father Michel I'll come for him," Marie said. "But first, I need to prepare a hiding place they'll never think to search." The messenger looked confused, but Marie was already moving toward the large brick oven that dominated the bakery's back wall. She had hoped never to use the emergency compartment she'd built behind it, a space barely large enough for one person, accessible only by removing several carefully loosened bricks. "Go," Marie urged the young woman. "Tell Father Michel to have the boy ready. I'll be there in 20 minutes. After the messenger left, Marie worked quickly to prepare the hiding space. She lined it with blankets and placed a small water bottle inside, along with some bread and cheese. The compartment would be cramped and uncomfortable, but it could keep a child alive for several days if necessary. The sound of trucks rumbling through the distant streets reminded Marie that time was running short. She grabbed a large basket and filled it with her morning's failed bread loaves, creating a plausible excuse for an early trip to the church. The burnt offerings would serve as charitable donations for Father Michel's soup kitchen. Before leaving, Marie took one last look around her bakery. The domain she had built so carefully, the perfect cover that had allowed her to save dozens of lives. If her luck ran out tonight, she would never see this place again. The Gestapo showed no mercy to those who harbored enemies of the Reich. She stepped into the cold morning air, basket in hand, and began walking toward a fate that could cost her everything. The bell above the door chimed, and Marie's shoulders tensed until she recognized Madame Dubois shuffling inside, her weathered face creased with worry. "The usual?" Marie asked, forcing normalcy into her voice. "Marie, dear." Madame Dubois leaned across the counter, lowering her voice to a whisper. "The Kraus family, they were taken last night, right from their hiding place in the old mill." The rolling pin slipped from Marie's flour-dusted fingers, clattering against the wooden counter. "Taken?" Herded into trucks like cattle. The little ones were crying. Madame Dubois shook her head. Someone must have told them exactly where to look. They went straight to the cellar door, no searching, no hesitation. Marie's stomach twisted into knots. The Kraus family had been one of hers, a family she'd helped smuggle through the village 2 weeks ago. She'd personally delivered them to what should have been a safe house. Perhaps they were careless, Marie managed, though the words tasted like ash. "No." Madame Dubois' eyes were sharp despite her age. "Someone gave them up. The question is who?" After the old woman left, Marie locked the bakery door and flipped the sign to closed. Her hands trembled as she made her way to the storage room, pushing aside sacks of flour to reveal the hidden panel she'd installed months ago. Inside lay her radio equipment, carefully wrapped in oilcloth. She assembled the pieces with practiced efficiency, her fingers working from muscle memory while her mind raced. The transmission window wouldn't open for another 2 hours, but she needed to warn her contacts. If the Kraus family had been betrayed, others were in danger. The radio crackled to life just as footsteps echoed in the alley behind the bakery. Marie froze, listening. Heavy boots, measured pace, definitely German. She quickly dismantled the radio, shoving components back into their hiding place as the footsteps grew closer. A sharp knock rattled the back door. "Fräulein Dubois?" The voice was unfamiliar, younger than Weber's. "Open, please. Routine inspection." Marie's pulse hammered against her throat. Routine inspections didn't happen at midday, and they certainly didn't target individual businesses. She smoothed her apron, checked that no evidence remained visible, and opened the door. Two SS officers stood in the narrow alley, their black uniforms stark against the weathered brick walls. The younger one, barely out of his teens, held a clipboard. His companion was older, with cold grey eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of her appearance. "Inspection?" Marie kept her voice steady. "But I was visited this morning by Hauptmann Weber." "Different matter entirely," the older officer said, pushing past her into the storage room. "We have reports of unusual activity in this area. Radio transmissions?" Marie's blood turned to ice, but she forced herself to appear confused. "Radio transmissions? I'm afraid I don't understand." The young officer consulted his clipboard. "You live alone above the bakery?" "Yes." "No visitors? No unusual sounds at night?" "Only the mice in the walls, I'm afraid." Marie watched the older officer methodically examining her shelves, moving sacks and checking corners. His movements were too precise, too knowing. He was looking for something specific. "These flour sacks," he said suddenly. "They've been moved recently. I rearrange my inventory regularly. It helps prevent spoilage." He continued probing, and Marie realized with growing horror that he was working his way systematically toward the hidden panel. Her mind raced through possibilities, denial, misdirection, even running, but each option led to the same inevitable conclusion. The officer's hand paused on the exact sack that concealed her radio. "Interesting," he murmured, beginning to push it aside. Marie stepped forward, desperation making her bold. "Officer, surely you have more important matters than a baker's storage habits. I have bread rising that will be ruined if I don't tend to it soon." He looked at her sharply, and she saw suspicion crystallizing in his eyes. "Your bread can wait." His hand moved toward the hidden panel, inches from discovery. Marie's mouth went dry as she calculated the distance to the kitchen knives, knowing even as she did that it was futile. 2 armed SS officers against a baker with flour under her fingernails. The radio panel remained hidden, but just barely. 1 more inch and her carefully constructed life would crumble. Along with it, the lives of countless others who depended on the network she helped maintain. The officer's fingers touched the edge of the panel. Then, from the front of the bakery, came the sound of insistent knocking and a familiar voice calling her name. The abandoned mill stood like a broken tooth against the grey dawn sky, its water wheel frozen by winter ice. Marie's breath formed clouds as she approached the rendezvous point, her baker's apron hidden beneath a heavy wool coat. The weight of the Luger in her pocket felt heavier with each step. She wasn't supposed to be here. The message from Claude had been clear: radio silence for 48 hours after yesterday's close call with Richter. But the coded note slipped under her bakery door at 3 in the morning changed everything. 3 families, children among them, the safe house in Lyons compromised. Marie checked her watch. 5 minutes early. Good. She needed time to scan the perimeter to ensure this wasn't the trap her instincts screamed it might be. The mill's broken windows stared down at her like dead eyes, and she fought the urge to turn back. Trust was a luxury the resistance couldn't afford. Yet here she was, betting everything on intelligence from a source she'd never met. Footsteps crunched through the frost-brittle grass behind her. Marie's hand found the pistol's grip as she turned, then relaxed slightly. A young woman emerged from the tree line, perhaps 25, with the hollow-eyed look of someone who'd seen too much. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and she moved with the careful precision of a person accustomed to staying invisible. "You're the baker," the woman said, not a question. "Depends who's asking." Marie's voice carried the authority she'd learned to project in these situations, firm enough to command respect, quiet enough not to carry. "Sylvie Moreau, Claude sent me." The woman glanced nervously at the mill. "We need to move them tonight. The Germans will raid Lyons tomorrow at dawn." Marie studied Sylvie's face, searching for tells. The way her left eye twitched when she mentioned Claude, the slight tremor in her hands, either genuine fear or expertly performed deception. "How do you know about the raid?" My boyfriend, SS Unterscharführer Hans Müller. He drinks too much, talks too much. Sylvie's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. He doesn't know I understand German as well as I do. A collaborator with a conscience or a Gestapo honey trap? Marie had encountered both. The former were invaluable until they cracked under pressure. The latter were death sentences with pretty faces. Where are the families now? Warehouse district, near the old textile factory. They've been hiding in a basement for 6 days, no food left, and one of the children is sick with fever. Sylvie pulled a crumpled paper from her coat. I drew a map. Marie took the paper but didn't look at it immediately. Instead, she watched Sylvie's reaction. Genuine relief or disappointment that the bait wasn't taken immediately. Claude didn't mention you before. Claude doesn't know about me, not directly. The information comes through Father Bernard at Saint-Étienne. Sylvie's explanation came quickly, as if rehearsed. The priest thought it safer to keep the chain compartmentalized. That rang true. Father Bernard was paranoid about operational security, sometimes to the point of hampering their effectiveness. Marie unfolded the map, noting the precise handwriting, the careful notation of German patrol routes and timing. Either Sylvie was exactly what she claimed to be, or the Gestapo had done their homework thoroughly. The route to Spain, Marie said. How much does your boyfriend know about increased patrols near the border? They've tripled the guards at the main crossing points. But Hans mentioned something about a new supply convoy route through the mountains, less monitored. Sylvie stepped closer, lowering her voice further. There's more. Richter suspects someone in town is feeding information to the resistance. He's planning house-to-house searches starting tomorrow night. Marie's blood chilled. If true, it meant her carefully constructed cover was deteriorating faster than she'd feared. If false, it was perfectly calculated to force her into panicked action. Did he mention any specific suspects? The teacher, Madame Fontaine, the postmaster, and... Sylvie hesitated, then met Marie's eyes directly. The baker who asks too many questions about rationing schedules. The words hit like physical blows. Marie forced her expression to remain neutral while her mind raced through contingencies. 3 families to evacuate, her own cover potentially blown, limited time and resources. And standing before her, a woman who was either salvation or doom wrapped in a threadbare coat. If I help you, Marie said slowly, I'll need proof that you are who you claim to be. Something Hans told you that only someone close to him would know. Sylvie reached into her pocket and pulled out a small silver locket. She opened it to reveal a photograph of herself with a tall, uniformed German officer. On the back, in German script, to my beloved Sylvie, until we meet again in the fatherland. Hans. Marie stared at the photograph, her decision crystallizing. Real or fabricated, the intelligence about the raid couldn't be ignored. 3 families would die if she was wrong about trusting Sylvie. But hundreds might die if this was a trap and her network was exposed. Tonight, then, she said, pocketing the map. 1 hour after midnight. The Gestapo officer's boots echoed against the cobblestones as he approached Marie's bakery, each step sending ice through her veins. She forced herself to continue kneading the morning bread, her movements steady despite the tremor threatening her hands. Through the window, she watched Sturmbannführer Klaus Weber stride purposefully toward her door, his grey uniform pressed to perfection, his pale eyes scanning the street like a predator sensing wounded prey. The bell chimed as he entered, and Marie looked up with what she hoped resembled surprise rather than terror. Sturmbannführer Weber, good morning. How may I help you? Weber removed his cap, revealing thinning blonde hair slicked back with pomade. His smile never reached his eyes. Fräulein Dubois, I trust you are well. I find myself in need of your perspective on certain matters. Marie wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron, buying precious seconds to compose herself. Of course. Would you like some coffee? I have real beans today. That would be most kind. Weber settled into the chair by the window, the same spot where just yesterday she had handed forged papers to the Goldstein family before they disappeared into the network of safe houses stretching toward the Swiss border. The irony was not lost on her. As Marie prepared the coffee, her mind raced through possibilities. Had someone talked? Were there witnesses to the midnight meetings in her cellar? She had been so careful, but in this business, careful was often not enough. "Tell me, Fräulein," Weber began, accepting the steaming cup. "Have you noticed anything unusual in the neighborhood recently? Any irregularities?" Marie sat across from him, cradling her own cup to hide the slight shake in her hands. "Unusual how? The war has made everything unusual, hasn't it?" Weber chuckled, but the sound was devoid of warmth. "Indeed. But I speak of something more specific. We have reason to believe that certain undesirable elements have been relocated from this area without proper documentation. Jewish families, to be precise." The coffee turned bitter in Marie's mouth. She forced herself to take another sip, using the moment to study Weber's face. His expression remained neutral, but she caught the calculating gleam in his eyes as he watched her reaction. "I hadn't noticed," she said carefully, "though I must admit, I don't pay much attention to the comings and goings of others. The bakery keeps me quite busy." "Naturally. Yet as a respected member of this community, surely you would notice if entire families simply vanished?" Marie set down her cup and leaned back slightly, as if considering the question. In truth, she was calculating distances to the back door, to the loose floorboard hiding her emergency papers, to the loaded pistol concealed beneath the counter. "Now that you mention it, I haven't seen the Goldsteins recently, or the Rosenbergs, but I assumed they had been relocated to the designated areas as per the regulations." Weber nodded slowly. "The Goldsteins, yes, an interesting case. They were scheduled for transport last Tuesday, yet when our officers arrived at their residence, they found it empty, clean, as if they had been warned." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Marie forced herself to meet his gaze directly. "That is troubling. Do you suspect they had help?" "I don't suspect, Fräulein. I know." Weber leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Someone in this neighborhood is operating an escape network, someone with access to forged documents, safe houses, and the trust of the Jewish community." Marie's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her expression concerned rather than terrified. "That's quite serious. Have you identified any suspects?" Weber's smile returned, cold and predatory. "Several. But I find it curious that many of these disappearances seem to cluster around this particular street. Your street, Fräulein. Perhaps because it's near the train station? It would be a logical starting point for those seeking to flee." "Perhaps." Weber stood abruptly, moving to examine the shelves of bread with theatrical interest. "Tell me, what do you know of Father Marcel at Saint-Pierre?" The question caught Marie off guard. Father Marcel had been instrumental in hiding children, using the church's ancient catacombs as temporary shelter. If Weber suspected him, he seems like a good man, very devoted to his congregation. And Dr. Laurent? Another key member of their network. Marie kept her voice steady. "I've only met him once or twice, when I needed medical attention." Weber turned back to her, and Marie realized with growing horror that he was enjoying this, the cat-and-mouse game, the slow tightening of the noose. "You see, Fräulein, what puzzles me is not the existence of this network. Resistance is to be expected. What puzzles me is its efficiency. This is not the work of amateurs stumbling in the dark. This is professional, organized. Someone with intelligence training is coordinating these operations." Marie's blood turned to ice. Her O's training. Had she been too efficient, too careful in ways that only another professional would recognize? Weber replaced his cap and moved toward the door. "I will be conducting more interviews in the coming days. I trust you will contact me immediately if you remember anything relevant." As the door closed behind him, Marie remained frozen in her chair, watching his retreating figure through the window. The net was closing, and she had perhaps hours before it tightened completely. The flour dust hung in the air like snow as Marie's hands worked the dough, her movements automatic after years of practice. But her mind was elsewhere, replaying every detail of yesterday's encounter with Hauptmann Weber, the way his pale eyes had lingered on her face, searching for cracks in her carefully constructed facade, the deliberate pause before he'd accepted her explanation about the extra bread orders. She'd survived the interrogation, but barely, and now Klaus Richter was dead. The news had spread through the village like wildfire. Found in his apartment with a single bullet wound, the collaborator's death officially blamed on resistance fighters. Marie knew better. Weber was cleaning house, eliminating anyone who might have compromised information about his operations. Klaus had been useful until he'd become a liability. The question that kept her awake all night was simple: how long before she joined him? Marie wiped her hands on her apron and moved to the door, checking the street through the grimy window before sliding back the bolt. Henri Dubois slipped inside, his face grave beneath his worn cap. "We have a problem," he said without preamble. "When don't we?" Marie locked the door behind him and gestured toward the back room, away from windows, away from prying eyes. Henri followed her, his boots silent on the worn wooden floor. The Goldstein family. They were supposed to move to the next safe house 2 days ago. Marie's stomach dropped. The Goldsteins, a middle-aged couple and their teenage daughter, had been hiding in the abandoned mill outside town for nearly a week. She'd been bringing them food, coordinating their passage to Switzerland through the network of contacts she'd spent 3 years building. What happened? The safe house was compromised. Gestapo raid yesterday morning. They arrested the family hiding there and the couple helping them. Henri's voice was flat, professional, but Marie could see the tension in his shoulders. "We had to abort the transfer. Are the Goldsteins secure?" "For now. But they can't stay much longer. The mill's too exposed, and with winter coming." He trailed off, but Marie understood. The nights were growing colder, and the family had little more than thin blankets and whatever food she could spare. "I'll figure something out." The words came automatically, but even as she spoke them, Marie felt the weight of impossibility pressing down on her chest. Every safe house in the region was either compromised or watched. The network was unraveling, contact by contact, family by family. Henri studied her face in the dim light. "There's something else. Weber's been asking questions about you specifically." The room seemed to tilt. "What kind of questions?" "About your supply routes. Why you need so much flour and sugar when rationing's so strict. He's noticed the discrepancies." Henri leaned against the wall, suddenly looking older than his 43 years. "Marie, I think he knows." The carefully constructed walls she'd built around her fear began to crumble. For 3 years, she'd maintained the perfect balance, enough compliance to avoid suspicion, enough resistance to save lives. But Weber wasn't like the other German officers who'd passed through the village. He was methodical, patient, deadly. "How long do I have? Maybe days, maybe hours." Henri reached into his jacket and pulled out a small pistol, pressing it into her hands. "Take this." Marie stared at the weapon, its weight foreign in her palms. She'd never fired a gun in her life. Her weapons had always been subtlety, misdirection, the ability to hide in plain sight. "I can't." "You can, and you will." Henri's voice was firm. Marie Larson, who bakes bread for German soldiers and smiles at their jokes, she served her purpose. "But if Weber comes for you, that woman won't survive. You need to be ready to become someone else." Through the thin walls, Marie heard the familiar sound of boots on cobblestones. German patrol making their morning rounds. In a few minutes, the village would wake up and she'd open the bakery doors to another day of performance, smiling at customers who might be informants, measuring flour while calculating how much she could spare for families hiding in shadows, pretending her heart didn't race every time she heard approaching footsteps. She slipped the pistol into the deep pocket of her apron, feeling its outline against her hip. "The Goldsteins, I'll move them tonight. There's a storage room beneath the church that Father Bernard showed me last month. It's not ideal, but it's better than the mill. Henri nodded. And after that? Marie looked toward the front of the bakery, where morning light was beginning to filter through the windows. Soon she'd need to light the ovens, begin the day's bread, step back into her role as the village baker, who caused no trouble and asked no questions. After that, we see how good of an actress I really am. The pre-dawn darkness felt different this morning, heavier somehow, as Marie kneaded the dough with mechanical precision. Her hands worked a familiar rhythm, while her mind raced through the evening's events. The Hoffman family had made it safely through the tunnel system, but their escape had been too close. Captain Weber's unexpected visit to the bakery still sent chills down her spine. She shaped the loaves with extra care, knowing that normalcy was her armor. The sweet smell of rising bread filled the kitchen, a scent that had protected her secret for 2 years. But protection felt fragile now, like spun sugar that could shatter at the slightest pressure. The bell above the front door chimed at precisely 7 o'clock. Through the kitchen doorway, Marie saw Father Auguste enter, his weathered face grave beneath his black beret. He approached the counter with his usual shuffling gait, but his eyes held an urgency that made her stomach clench. "Good morning, Father," she called, wiping flour from her hands. "The usual today?" "Perhaps something different," he replied, his voice carrying the coded inflection they'd developed. "I hear the morning deliveries were delayed." Marie's blood turned to ice. Delayed deliveries meant danger. Someone in their network had been compromised. She moved to the display case, her movements steady despite the tremor in her chest. "Which route?" she asked quietly, pretending to examine the pastries. "The northern one." A neighbor became curious about the midnight visitors. Father Auguste's fingers drummed nervously against the glass. There may have been talk. The Dubois farmhouse. Marie had suspected their northern safe house was becoming too visible, but they'd had no choice with the increasing number of refugees. Now their caution had proven insufficient. "How much talk?" She wrapped a loaf of bread in brown paper, her hands steady through years of practice, enough to reach interested ears. "I suspect questions will be asked soon." Through the window, Marie spotted the familiar grey uniform of a German patrol making its morning rounds. Her throat tightened, but she continued her transaction with practiced calm. The soldiers passed without stopping, but their presence felt like a noose tightening around the village. After Father Auguste left with his coded warnings, Marie retreated to her kitchen and activated the hidden radio concealed behind the flour bins. The morning transmission crackled through static, bringing news that confirmed her worst fears. 3 safe houses across the region had been raided in the past 48 hours. The net was closing. She encoded her own message with trembling fingers, warning the remaining network to suspend operations temporarily. Every tap of the Morse key felt like a nail in a coffin, not her own, but that of the dozens of people depending on their underground railroad. The kitchen door burst open without warning. Marie's hand flew to the radio's power switch, but it was too late. Captain Weber stood in the doorway, his pale eyes taking in every detail of the scene. Behind him, 2 SS officers flanked the entrance like hunting dogs. "Fräulein Dubois," Weber said, his voice silk over steel. "How industrious you are, working so early." "The bread won't bake itself, Captain." Marie's voice emerged steadier than she'd dared hope. "Though I must say, your men seem quite interested in my kitchen routines lately." Weber stepped closer, his boots clicking against the stone floor. The radio sat partially hidden behind bags of flour, its antenna barely visible. One wrong glance and everything would unravel. "Indeed. We've been having such interesting conversations with your neighbors. The Rousseau family mentioned seeing unusual activity near the old mill. Late-night visitors, they said. Lights where there should be darkness." Marie continued kneading a fresh batch of dough, using the motion to steady her nerves. "People see many things in wartime, Captain. Sometimes fear creates shadows where none exist." "Shadows." Weber smiled, but the expression held no warmth. An interesting choice of words. "Tell me, have you noticed any shadows yourself?" Perhaps families who disappear without explanation? Jewish families, specifically? The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Marie shaped another loaf, buying precious seconds to consider her response. In the corner of her vision, she could see one of the SS officers moving closer to the radio's hiding spot. "Jewish families left long ago, Captain. There's been no one like that in our village for months." "No one?" Weber's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "How curious, because we have reports of at least 3 families passing through this area in recent weeks, families who seem to have vanished into thin air." The SS officer's hand brushed against the flour sack concealing the radio. Marie's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to meet Weber's gaze directly. "Perhaps you should speak with the mayor about such matters, Captain. I'm simply a baker. My concern is bread, not politics." Weber studied her face for a long moment, searching for cracks in her composure. "Of course, but even bakers hear things, don't they?" The cellar had never felt smaller. Marie pressed her back against the cold stone wall, listening to the footsteps above grow louder, more deliberate. 3 sharp knocks echoed through the bakery, the Gestapo's calling card. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she counted the shadows huddled in the darkness around her, 12 souls whose lives hung by the thread of her next decision. Sarah Goldstein clutched her infant daughter closer, the baby's breathing shallow but mercifully silent. An elderly man Marie knew only as Professor held his wife's trembling hand, while a family of 4 sat rigid against the far wall, their eyes reflecting the dim light like trapped animals. They had been here for 3 days, waiting for the all-clear signal that never came. Another knock, followed by the unmistakable sound of jackboots crossing her threshold. Marie's throat constricted. She had left the front door unlocked, standard practice for a baker expecting morning customers. Now that mundane detail might doom them all. "Stay silent," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "No matter what you hear." She climbed the narrow stairs, each step a small eternity. Through the thin wall separating the cellar from the bakery's main floor, she could hear voices, crisp, German, punctuated by Henri's nervous French. Her assistant was buying her precious seconds, but his voice carried the strain of a man walking a tightrope. Marie emerged behind the counter, forcing her features into an expression of mild curiosity rather than terror. Sturmbannführer Klaus stood near the window, his pale eyes scanning the bakery with predatory interest. Beside him, a younger officer she didn't recognize held a leather folder thick with documents. "Ah, Mademoiselle Dubois," Klaus said, his French flawless but cold. "How convenient. We were just discussing your excellent bread with your assistant." Henri caught her eye briefly, a warning flickering in his gaze. He had positioned himself near the flour barrels, close to the concealed cellar entrance. Smart boy, she thought, even as her stomach churned. "Herr Sturmbannführer," Marie replied, wiping flour from her hands with deliberate calm. "An honor, as always, though I fear I have little bread left this morning. The rations, you understand." Klaus's smile held no warmth. "Indeed, though it seems some citizens of Beaumont have been receiving more than their fair share of provisions." He gestured to his companion. "Oberleutnant Fischer has brought some interesting intelligence to my attention." Fischer opened his folder with practiced efficiency. "We have reports of unusual activity in this district. Families disappearing in the night, empty houses with still warm ovens, fresh breadcrumbs leading to strange places." His eyes fixed on Marie. "One might think someone has been feeding people who should not be fed." The words hung in the air like smoke. Marie felt the weight of 12 lives pressing down from below, but kept her expression neutral. "I'm afraid I don't understand, Herr Oberleutnant. I bake bread. People buy bread. Sometimes they move away. These are difficult times." "Yes," Klaus murmured, beginning to pace. "Difficult times indeed. Times when loyal citizens must make hard choices." He paused beside the counter, his fingers drumming against the wood directly above the hidden entrance. "Tell me, Marie, may I call you Marie? What do you know about the Goldstein family?" The name hit her like a physical blow, but she had years of practice hiding her reactions. Goldstein? I'm sorry, the name isn't familiar. Strange. They lived just 3 streets from here. A young mother, newborn baby. The kind of family that might need fresh bread delivered, perhaps? Klaus's voice remained conversational, but his eyes had gone flat and dangerous. They vanished 4 nights ago, along with their neighbors, the Rosenbergs. And, curiously, your flower deliveries have increased by 30% this month. Henri shifted nervously beside the barrels. Marie could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. She needed to end this, now, before someone's nerve broke entirely. "Gentlemen," she said, spreading her hands in a gesture of openness, "I admire your thoroughness, but I'm simply a baker. If you suspect me of black market trading, please search my supplies. You'll find nothing but flour, yeast, and the honest sweat of hard work." Klaus studied her face for a long moment, and Marie felt as though he were peering directly into her soul. Below, she knew 12 people held their breath. 12 hearts beat in terrified synchronization with her own. A search, Klaus said finally, might indeed be illuminating. Fischer stepped forward eagerly, but Klaus raised a hand to stop him, though perhaps unnecessary, for now. His smile returned sharp as a blade. "We'll be watching Marie very closely, and when we return, not if, when, we'll expect complete cooperation." The Gestapo officers moved toward the door with unhurried confidence, but Klaus paused at the threshold. "One more thing," he said softly. "Loyalty to the Reich is not optional. Remember that." The door closed behind them with a soft click that sounded like the cocking of a gun. The Gestapo officer's boots echoed against the cobblestones as he approached Marie's bakery for the 3rd time this week. Through the flour-dusted window, she watched Hauptmann Weber's methodical stride, each step calculated to intimidate. Her hands trembled as she arranged yesterday's remaining loaves, muscle memory keeping her movements steady while her mind raced. The bell above the door chimed its familiar greeting, a sound that once brought her joy but now felt like a death knell. Weber removed his cap, revealing thinning brown hair slicked back with pomade. His pale eyes swept the bakery with the practiced efficiency of a predator. "Good morning, Madame Dubois." His French carried a thick German accent that made her name sound like an accusation. "Hauptmann Weber." Marie wiped her hands on her apron, grateful for the excuse to steady herself. "How may I help you today? I find myself curious about your flour supplies." He moved toward the counter with deliberate slowness. "My records indicate you've been receiving larger shipments than other bakeries your size." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Marie had anticipated this question, had rehearsed her answer countless times while kneading dough in the pre-dawn darkness. The extra flour wasn't for bread. It was for the false bottom compartments beneath her ovens where families waited in suffocating silence for safe passage to Switzerland. "I've been experimenting with different recipes," she replied, meeting his gaze directly. "The German soldiers stationed here have specific preferences. I want to ensure I can accommodate their needs." Weber's thin lips curved into something resembling a smile. "How thoughtful of you." He moved behind the counter without invitation, his presence violating the sacred space where she'd hidden so many desperate souls. "Show me these recipes." Marie's heart hammered against her ribs. The recipe book sat innocuously on the shelf, but hidden between its pages were coded messages from the resistance, safe house locations, and train schedules. Her salvation and damnation bound in faded leather. She reached for the book, her fingers brushing against Weber's gloved hand as he intercepted it. The contact sent ice through her veins. He opened to a random page, scanning her grandmother's handwritten notes about brioche preparation. "Interesting," he murmured, turning pages with maddening slowness. "You write many notes in the margins. My grandmother's recipes. I add my own observations." The lie flowed smoothly, perfected through months of practice. A muffled sound from below made both of them freeze. Marie's blood turned to winter as she recognized the distinctive creak of the hidden compartment's floorboard. 12-year-old Sarah Goldstein was down there with her baby brother. waiting for tonight's crossing. The child had been fighting a fever for 2 days. Weber's head tilted like a hunting dog catching a scent. What was that? The foundation's settling, Marie said quickly. This building is over 200 years old. The cellar stones shift constantly. He closed the recipe book with a sharp snap, his eyes never leaving her face. I think I should inspect your cellar. Of course. Marie moved toward the stairs, praying the Goldstein children had heard Weber's voice and retreated deeper into the shadows. Though I warn you, it's quite cramped and dusty down there. Each step descended into nightmare. The cellar smelled of yeast and fear, familiar scents that had become her constant companions. Weber's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating barrels of flour and wine, the innocent facade that concealed her true purpose. He knelt beside the largest flour barrel, running his hands along its base. Marie watched in frozen horror as his fingers traced the nearly invisible seam that marked the entrance to the hidden passage. Years of careful construction, dozens of lives saved, all balanced on the edge of his discovery. This barrel seems oddly positioned, he observed. The previous owner arranged the cellar. I've never had reason to change it. Weber stood, brushing dust from his uniform. The flashlight beam swept across the ceiling, past the camouflaged ventilation shaft that provided air to the hidden chamber. Marie forced herself to breathe normally, though every instinct screamed at her to run. You know, Madame Dubois, there have been reports of unusual activity in this neighborhood. His voice carried the casual menace of a man who held life and death in his hands. Families disappearing in the night. Food vanishing from ration supplies. I wouldn't know anything about that, Marie replied. I keep to myself and my baking. I'm sure you do, he said finally. Good day, Madame Dubois. I suspect we'll speak again very soon. The door closed behind him with finality that felt like a judgment. Marie sank against the counter, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. Outside, Weber's boots resumed their methodical rhythm, but she knew he hadn't gone far. The game was accelerating toward its inevitable conclusion, and she was running out of moves. The pre-dawn darkness felt different this morning, thick with an electric tension that made Marie's skin crawl as she unlocked the bakery door. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned the key, not from the November cold, but from the knowledge that Hauptmann Weber would return today for his answer. 24 hours had passed since he'd cornered her with photographs of the Rousseau family and demanded information about their disappearance. Inside the bakery, she moved through her routine with mechanical precision, muscle memory guiding her hands while her mind raced. The bread dough from yesterday's preparation waited in the cool storage room, ready for the final rise and baking. She pulled the heavy trays onto the work counter, each movement deliberate and practiced, maintaining the facade that had protected her for 3 years. The back door's soft knock came at exactly 5:30 as expected. Marie's pulse quickened as she recognized the pattern. 2 quick raps, pause, 3 more. Henri slipped inside, followed by a woman Marie had never seen before. The stranger clutched a small suitcase and wore the haunted expression Marie knew too well. "This is Sarah Goldstein," Henri whispered, his breath visible in the cool air. "Her husband was taken 2 days ago. She needs to reach the monastery tonight." Marie studied the woman's face, noting the determination mixed with desperation. Sarah couldn't be more than 25, with dark hair hastily dyed an unconvincing shade of brown and nervous eyes that darted constantly toward the windows. Another life hanging in the balance, another soul trusting Marie to deliver her to safety. "The situation has changed," Marie said quietly, pulling Henri aside while Sarah examined the bakery's interior with fearful curiosity. "Weber suspects something. He showed me photographs yesterday, asked direct questions about missing families." Henri's face went pale in the dim light. "How much does he know?" "Enough to be dangerous. Not enough to arrest me yet." Marie began shaping the bread dough with more force than necessary, working out her anxiety through the familiar motions. "He's giving me one more chance to cooperate voluntarily before he takes more aggressive measures. We can postpone." Henri nodded reluctantly. The monastery contact confirmed the route is still secure, but only until midnight. After that, they're moving to a different location. Marie's hands worked automatically, dividing dough into portions for the morning's baguettes. The familiar rhythm helped calm her racing thoughts as she calculated risks and possibilities. Weber would return sometime this afternoon, probably after lunch when the bakery filled with its usual customers. If she could get Sarah to the handoff point before then, she might buy enough time to manage the situation. "There's something else," Henri continued, his voice barely audible. "We received word that 3 safe houses in the southern district were raided last night. They're coordinating a massive sweep." The bread dough slipped from Marie's fingers, hitting the counter with a soft thud. 3 safe houses meant dozens of people captured or killed, an entire section of the resistance network compromised. The walls were closing in faster than anyone had anticipated. Sarah approached them, her footsteps silent on the bakery's worn wooden floor. "I couldn't help overhearing," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "If I'm putting you in greater danger, I can try to find another way." Marie looked at this stranger, who was willing to sacrifice her own chance at freedom to protect people she'd just met. It was the same courage that had driven Marie to join the resistance, the same moral imperative that made collaboration with the Nazis impossible despite the consequences. "No," Marie said firmly, "we proceed as planned, but we need to move the timeline forward." She turned to Henri. "Can you reach the contact at the monastery? Tell them to expect delivery by 10 this morning instead of tonight. That's only 4 hours from now. The roads will still have patrols." "The roads always have patrols, but Weber won't expect movement during daylight, and Sarah can travel with the morning supply delivery to the convent. Sister Catherine makes that run every Tuesday." Marie felt a familiar mixture of terror and exhilaration, the same feeling she'd experienced with every successful rescue over the past 3 years. Each time she risked everything. Each time she found the courage to continue. As the first grey light of dawn crept through the bakery windows, Marie began preparing for what might be her final act of defiance. The bread would rise, the customers would come, and Hauptmann Weber would return for his answer. But first, Sarah Goldstein would disappear. The cellar door groaned as Marie descended into darkness, her baker's apron still dusted with flour from the morning's bread. 3 oil lamps cast dancing shadows across the stone walls where 12 people huddled in silence. 2 families with children who hadn't seen sunlight in 4 days, and 3 young men who'd escaped a labor transport bound for Germany. Sarah Roth clutched her infant daughter closer to her chest. "What about the patrols? They've doubled since they found the Dubois farm empty." Marie's words hung in the stale air like smoke. The Gestapo had discovered 3 safe houses in the past week, their occupants vanished without a trace. Someone was talking, feeding information to the Germans with surgical precision. Trust had become as scarce as butter. Footsteps echoed overhead, heavy boots crossing the bakery floor above. Marie pressed her finger to her lips and moved toward the hidden ladder. Through the floorboards she could hear muffled voices, then the distinctive sound of her cash register opening. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "Madame Dubois?" Klaus Richter's voice filtered down through the wood. The Oberfuhrer never visited alone, unless something had gone very wrong. She climbed swiftly, emerging through the concealed panel behind the flour sacks. The cellar door sealed itself with practiced silence as she brushed wheat dust from her skirt and stepped into the main bakery. Richter stood examining a loaf of her morning bread, turning it over in his manicured hands like evidence. Behind him, 2 SS officers flanked the entrance while a third rifled through her account ledgers. "Herr Oberfuhrer," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady, "you honor my humble bakery. How may I serve you?" His pale eyes studied her face with the intensity of a hawk examining prey. "Your flour consumption has increased by 30% in recent weeks, yet your reported sales remain constant. This suggests either gross inefficiency or—" He let the implication drift between them like poison gas. "I've been experimenting with new recipes," Marie replied, moving to wipe down an already spotless counter. The German soldiers stationed here deserve the finest bread. I've been perfecting a traditional Bavarian recipe that requires multiple attempts. Show me." The words struck her like a physical blow. She had never actually attempted Bavarian bread. Her knowledge came from a cookbook stolen from a German supply convoy 3 months earlier, but refusing would sign death warrants for everyone hiding below her feet. Of course. She gathered ingredients with steady hands, muscle memory guiding her through motions while her mind raced. The recipe called for specific techniques she'd only read about, timing that had to be perfect to sell the deception. As she worked, kneading dough with deliberate precision, Richter continued his interrogation. "Tell me about the Roth family, jewelers from the old quarter. They disappeared the night before their scheduled deportation." "I rarely visit that part of town," Marie said, shaping the dough into traditional Bavarian form. "My customers come to me, yet witnesses placed a woman matching your description near their shop that very evening." The dough slipped slightly in her hands. She recovered quickly, but not before Richter's eyes narrowed with interest. Below her feet, 12 people breathed quietly in darkness, their lives balanced on her ability to lie convincingly. "Many women in this town wear dark coats and headscarves, Herr Oberfuhrer. The cold makes us all look alike." "Perhaps." He moved closer, his shadow falling across her workspace. "But few women purchase medical supplies in quantities suitable for treating injuries. The pharmacy keeps meticulous records." Ice formed in her veins. She had bought bandages and antiseptic 2 weeks ago for a resistant fighter wounded during a supply drop. How could she have been so careless? "My elderly neighbor suffers from terrible leg ulcers," she said, sliding the shaped dough into the oven. "I help care for her when possible. Christian charity, you understand. Frau Dubois was arrested yesterday morning." The words hit her like bullets. Marie gripped the oven handle to keep from falling, her knuckles white against the black iron. Frau Dubois had never existed. She'd invented the fictional neighbor on the spot. But Richter had laid a trap, and she'd walked directly into it. I must have been mistaken about her name," she stammered. Richter smiled, a predator's expression full of sharp teeth and cold satisfaction. "Indeed, mistakes can be quite costly in wartime." He nodded to his men, who stepped forward with mechanical precision. "Marie Dubois, you are under arrest for harboring enemies of the Reich and crimes against the German state." The words echoed through the bakery as iron shackles clicked around her wrists. Below her feet, 12 people waited in darkness for salvation that would never come. The cellar walls seemed to pulse with Marie's heartbeat as she pressed her ear against the wooden door above. Footsteps echoed through the bakery, heavy boots, deliberate and searching. She counted at least 3 sets, maybe 4. The Gestapo had finally come. Behind her in the cramped underground chamber, 12 people barely breathed. The Rosen family huddled in one corner with their twin daughters, while old Samuel clutched his prayer book with trembling fingers. Marie had moved them all here just 2 hours ago when her contact at the train station sent word, roadblocks everywhere, documents being checked twice, and her name mentioned in hushed conversations among the SS officers. Above, something crashed to the floor. Flour sacks, most likely. They were tearing apart her life's work, looking for evidence of what they already suspected. Marie closed her eyes and steadied herself. Everything depended on the next few minutes. She turned to face the frightened eyes watching her in the dim candlelight. "Stay silent," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "No matter what you hear." The hidden passage she'd spent months preparing led from this cellar through the old wine tunnels beneath the street, emerging in the abandoned mill by the river. From there, Henri would be waiting with papers and a truck. But the tunnel entrance required moving a heavy stone, and the grinding sound would carry upstairs if she wasn't careful. More crashes echoed above. They were being systematic now, checking every board, every corner. Soon they would find the loose floorboard that concealed the entrance to her cellar. She had perhaps 10 minutes. Marie knelt beside the stone that blocked their escape route. She had practiced this movement dozens of times, but never with lives hanging in the balance. Her hands found the iron rings embedded in the rock, and she began to pull. The stone shifted slightly, then held. Years of flour dust and moisture had made it stick. 8-year-old Sarah Rosen started to whimper. Her mother quickly covered the child's mouth, but not before the sound escaped. Above them, the footsteps stopped. Marie's blood turned to ice. In the sudden silence, she could hear her own pulse thundering in her ears. Then the footsteps resumed, but now they were focused, moving deliberately toward the back of the bakery, where the entrance lay hidden. She pulled harder on the stone. It moved another inch, then another. The gap was almost wide enough now, but still too narrow for the adults to squeeze through. Her shoulders burned with the effort, and sweat dripped into her eyes despite the cellar's chill. A new sound froze everyone in place, the scraping of wood above their heads. They had found the loose floorboard. A thin beam of light suddenly pierced the darkness as someone lifted the board just enough to peer down. Marie held her breath. The false floor she had constructed would hold casual inspection, but if they brought a light down here, if they really looked— The beam of light swept across what appeared to be an empty root cellar, complete with dusty shelves and forgotten preserves. Marie had spent weeks creating this deception, aging every surface, scattering mouse droppings, even cultivating cobwebs. To any observer, it looked exactly like what it was supposed to be, a storage space abandoned years ago. After what felt like an eternity, the light disappeared. The floorboards settled back into place with a soft thud, but Marie knew their reprieve was temporary. The officer above was thorough. He would be back with better equipment, more men. She had to get these people out now. The stone finally gave way with the softest grinding sound. Marie bit back a gasp of relief as the opening widened enough for passage. She gestured urgently to the Rosen family. "Go now, quickly but quietly. Follow the tunnel straight until you reach the iron ladder." One by one, they slipped through the opening. The twins went first, guided by their father's steady hands. Samuel needed help, his arthritic joints protesting as he squeezed through the narrow gap. Marie counted each person as they disappeared into the darkness of the tunnel. As the last figure vanished, she heard the floorboard above being lifted again. This time, multiple lights pierced the false ceiling of her hiding place. Voices spoke in rapid German. They had brought equipment to examine the cellar more thoroughly. Marie slipped through the opening and began pulling the stone back into place from the inside. Her fingers found the interior handholds just as the first flashlight beam swept directly over where she had been standing seconds before. The stones settled into position with barely a whisper. Through the tunnel's blackness ahead, she could hear the soft shuffle of feet moving toward freedom. Behind her, lights danced, and voices grew more frustrated as they searched an empty space. She turned toward the tunnel and began to crawl, following the path she had prepared for this moment, leaving behind everything she had built for the chance to save the lives that mattered most. The pre-dawn darkness felt different this morning, heavier, charged with the weight of 17 chapters of careful deception finally reaching their crescendo. Marie's hands moved through the familiar motions of kneading dough, but her mind was entirely focused on the sounds filtering through the bakery's thin walls. Footsteps. Too many footsteps for this hour. She had perhaps 10 minutes before they would come for her. The radio message last night had been brief but clear. The network was compromised, her identity blown, and evacuation protocols were in effect. But Marie couldn't simply vanish into the night like the others. Beneath her feet, in the cellar she'd spent months preparing, 12 Jewish refugees waited for transport that wouldn't come until tomorrow evening. Abandoning them now meant certain death. The bell above her door chimed, and Marie's blood turned to ice. No customers came this early. Through the flour-dusted window, she could see the unmistakable silhouettes of German uniforms against the pale morning light. Mademoiselle Dubois? The voice belonged to Hauptmann Weber, the Gestapo officer who'd been circling her like a predator for weeks. "We need to speak with you." Marie wiped her hands on her apron, buying precious seconds to steady her breathing. "Of course, Hauptmann. Though I'm afraid I've nothing but yesterday's bread to offer. The morning batch won't be ready for another hour." Weber stepped inside, followed by 3 soldiers. His pale eyes swept the bakery with practiced efficiency, cataloguing every detail. "We're not here for bread. We've received information about your other activities." The words hung in the air like smoke from a crematorium. Marie forced herself to meet his gaze, channeling every ounce of the innocent baker she'd pretended to be. "I'm afraid I don't understand." Missing persons reports, falsified papers, safe houses. Weber's boots clicked against the wooden floor as he moved closer. Crimes against the Reich that carry the death penalty. Below them, Marie knew the refugees would be hearing every word. She drilled them on this scenario. If discovery seemed imminent, they were to use the emergency tunnel that connected to the wine cellar next door. But the tunnel was narrow, slow-going with children and elderly among their number. She needed more time. "Hauptmann, surely you don't suspect me of such things." Marie let a tremor creep into her voice, not entirely feigned. "I'm just a baker. I work alone. I keep to myself. Ask anyone in the village." Weber smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. "Oh, but we have asked. And do you know what we've learned? That you're remarkably well liked for someone so unremarkable. People speak of your generosity, your late-night charity work." He paused, letting the implication settle. "Tell me, what charity work requires such secrecy?" The sound of a child's muffled cough drifted up from below, so faint that Marie prayed the Germans hadn't heard it. Weber's head tilted slightly, like a dog catching a scent. "Search the building," he ordered his men. "Every room, every closet. Tear up the floorboards if necessary." This was it. The moment Marie had known would come eventually, the choice she'd prepared for, but hoped never to face. She could confess, try to bargain for the refugees' lives with her own, or she could fight, knowing the cost would likely be all their deaths. Instead, she chose a third option. "There's something I need to show you," she said quietly, moving toward the counter where she kept her receipts. "In the drawer." Weber nodded to his men, who followed her movement with raised weapons. Marie's hand closed around the small glass vial she'd hidden months ago, a final insurance policy for a situation exactly like this. The cyanide would be quick, cleaner than what the Gestapo had planned for her. But as she lifted the vial, the sound of engines roared to life outside. Not German engines. These were Allied vehicles, the rumble different, urgent. Through the window, she could see American uniforms, soldiers moving with military precision. Weber spun toward the sound, his face draining of color. The liberation forces had arrived 12 hours ahead of schedule. "Amerikaner," one of his soldiers breathed, the word carrying all the weight of defeat. What followed happened in seconds that stretched like hours. Weber reached for his sidearm just as the bakery door exploded inward. American soldiers poured through, their weapons trained on the Germans. Shouts in English filled the air, orders barked, hands raised in surrender. Marie let the vial slip from her fingers, watching it shatter against the floor as tears streamed down her face. Above the chaos, she could hear movement from the cellar, her refugees, realizing that survival was no longer just a desperate hope. The baker's daughter, who had spent 17 chapters living a lie, could finally tell the truth. The war wasn't over, but for Marie Dubois and the 12 souls she'd protected, this morning marked the beginning of freedom.